welcome to lesson 9. This is Longshore Drift and Spits. So we're now learning about transportation at the coast and deposition. So what you have to remember is that erosion is where material gets broken off from the cliff face. Transportation is where it gets carried away, and we're going to find out how that happens. And then lastly, it gets dropped off. So erosion is the wearing away of the rock, transportation is where it gets carried away, and then deposition is where it gets dropped off. Kindly write the title and copy the keywords. Please pause the video and answer the Connect questions. Study the map carefully for question 5 and 6. Okay, so here are your answers. Please check and correct. So we're going to learn about a process of transportation called longshore drift. So I'd like you to watch this animation really carefully, and then we're going to sketch it ourselves. So what happens first is the prevailing wind blows the wave onto the coast at an angle. Now the wave, the swash of the wave picks up a piece of sediment and deposits it onto the beach. Then the backwash of the wave, remember that word backwash, as it goes back out to sea, the backwash goes down the beach at a right angle due to gravity. So what you can see clearly here is that you have a zigzag motion that goes like this. And this process repeats. And this zigzag motion moves sediment along a beach over time. Please watch this animation and pause the video if you need to. Watch carefully the red dot, which is your grain of sand. So again, the waves approach the beach at an angle due to the prevailing wind direction. The swash deposits the grain of sand onto the beach, but then the backwash goes back down the beach at right angles due to gravity. And then watch what happens to this grain of sand over time. Okay, so we're going to draw this now. So if you could pause the video and then write transportation at the coast, longshore drift. Put a box around it, and we're going to draw a simple annotated diagram. So be kind, because I'm using a mouse to do this. So here's how it works. If you remember from the beginning, the prevailing wind comes in at an angle, and we can write this here. Just be aware that we're looking at the beach from above. So this is a bird's eye view. You have to imagine you're looking down on the coastline. Okay, the prevailing wind comes in at an angle. This means that the waves also come in at an angle, and the wave coming in is called the swash. So what happens is a pebble or a bit of sand, a grain of sand, is picked up just offshore, and it is deposited onto the beach at an angle there. What happens next is, because of gravity, the swash, which is the movement of the wave back down the beach, the swash goes back down at right angles to the beach. I'm just going to write that there, backwash. So our friend the pebble here on the beach there now ends up there. And what you have happening is the process repeating. So this zigzag motion continues. And what this means over time is that the pebble gets carried offshore at right angles, then back onshore at an angle, back offshore at right angles, then back onshore. And so what you can now do is you can annotate this with the overall direction of long longshore drift. This shows the direction of longshore drift. Now what we can do is we can take the process feature approach with this, and we can actually, I wouldn't really say prevailing wind is a feature. You can't see it, you can't touch it, but we do know it is a thing and it's there. So prevailing wind is going to be our feature. The process is longshore drift. Okay. Similarly, I suppose you could say swash is a feature of a wave, just as backwash is a feature of a wave. Okay, so we can do the process feature approach, but it's not too important here. Okay, so what I'd like you to do, please, is to write this question in your books. It says using a diagram. Well, look, we've already drawn that, okay, and you could see just how simple it was. I'd like you to pause the video, and then, the best way to do this, again, is a 4-mark explain, is tell it like a story. So the first word that we might want to use, if we're starting at the beginning, is firstly. Okay, firstly, what happens? Look carefully at your diagram and decide what happens first. Pause the video, give yourself 4 minutes. Let's take a look at the answers. So we could say first off that the prevailing wind, firstly, the prevailing wind makes the wave come in at an angle, which is important. That's our first mark. The second mark, the swash, picks up sediment. Make sure we've got the word swash in there, and deposits it. We didn't include that in our diagram, but we can now. The swash picks up the stone, the pebble, the sand, and deposits it on the beach. There's our second mark. The third mark, see, we've got the word next in there. So we've got a sequence. We have firstly, then we have secondly. Okay. Oh, sorry, we have firstly, then we have next or secondly. Okay. The backwash, we've got the word backwash in there, tick. The backwash carries the sediment back down the beach at a right angle. Look at your diagram, you can see it's at a right angle. There's our third mark. The fourth mark is important. You could have said longshore drift repeats. You could have said the process repeats. You could have said this transports sediment along the coastline. Reference the question. So the fourth mark is really explaining what happens next. This idea that things keep going, okay, which is essential. Again, you can see I've done the process feature approach here. It's not too important. So give yourself a mark out of 4 and please correct with green pen, and well done for doing that. Okay, so far so good. We've established that longshore drift transports sediment along the coastline, but we now need to understand what happens when the coastline changes direction. So if the coastline is going along like that and then suddenly it goes up, what's going to happen to all that sediment that's being moved along by longshore drift? Well, it changes direction at a bay or a headland, and also at a river estuary. Now this is where a river meets the sea. Let's take a look at this example. So longshore drift with the prevailing wind is transporting the sediment along. Now watch, the coastline changes direction suddenly. And what happens is that sediment gets deposited out to sea, and we call that a spit. What happens over time is that the end of it gets curved like a kind of a hook, and we call that the curved end. Also, behind the recurved end, as we call it, it gets curved by the wind. Behind that, we find an area called a salt marsh. Now, this tends to be a sheltered area behind the spit, which has a mix of salt water and often river water, and it can have a lot of mud and sediment in it as well, and you can even find plants growing in it. Okay, so longshore drift moves the sediment along, the coastline changes direction, then the sediment is deposited out to sea, and then finally what happens is a spit is formed and the end gets curved by the prevailing wind. Okay, so let's draw this. What I'd like you to do is draw a box and write the subtitle Transportation and Deposition at the Coast Spits. And we're going to draw a simple diagram that explains how spits are formed. Now, look, with this, you don't need to explain the entire process of longshore drift. It is enough just to say that longshore drift transports sediment along. So just to remind us, what we can do is draw a simple zigzag pattern showing how sediment is transported by the swash and the backwash that goes back out to sea. The next thing that happens, so you know what, that is our first process, longshore drift. Okay, we can mark that as our process, longshore drift. Point two, what happens at point two, we talked about this in the video, is that the coastline changes direction. The coastline changes direction. Often, we can add this in there, it changes direction at a bay or a river estuary. This is where the river meets the sea. So if 2 was our process where the coastline changes direction, then 3 is our feature, the bay or the estuary. The third thing that happens is that our sediment is being transported along the beach, and then as the coastline changes direction, it starts to get deposited out into the sea. So there is our really essential process there, deposition. So our first process was longshore drift. Our second process was the coastline changes direction, but the feature was a bay or an estuary. Then point 3 was this essential process of deposition, where the sediment gets dropped off out at sea. Then what happens is the spit starts to form and the end of it becomes curved. So here's point 4. So we have a spit forming and the end of it gets curved. The end of it gets curved by the prevailing wind. And then the last thing, so look, here's our really important feature here. We end up with a spit with a curved end. The last thing you can add on this is that you have a salt marsh where loads of plants can grow. Okay, you find these kind of salt-loving plants in the area, in the sheltered area behind the spit. So here is our spit. Look, if you're not sure about this, just remember that we're actually looking from above. This is a bird's eye view. We're looking down on the coastline, okay? People actually even can build houses on these kind of spits, all right? They can actually live on them in some places in the world where they're big enough, okay? So please annotate your diagrams. Make sure you've got the processes and the features marked on really clearly. And then we're going to write this up. So our question is to explain the formation of a sand spit. So what we're going to do is do things in order. First, we're going to talk about point 1. Then we talk about point 2, point 3, and then finally point 4. A good word to start, as always with this kind of geography, is something like firstly. So pause the video now. Pause the video now and see if you can answer that question. Okay, here are your answers. Firstly, longshore drift transports sediment along the coast. You didn't need to explain it in detail. There's your first mark, okay? Longshore drift transports sand, sediment, stones, pebbles, whatever, that's fine. The second mark, the coastline changes direction. That's a sort of a process, I suppose, but we've definitely got a feature in there. There's an estuary or a bay or a headland, okay? The third mark, sediment is deposited out to sea. Tick, we've got that essential process named there and there. The fourth mark you can get for saying a spit is formed. You can say the end is curved by the wind if you like. You could also mention salt marsh. The essential bit that you needed to mention was our feature. Finally, a spit is formed. Give yourselves marks out of 4 for that and correct whatever you didn't add into your answer. And I hope you did really well on that. Great stuff. So to finish up the lesson, how well do you know your destructive and constructive waves? Pause the video, write the answers. Great stuff. That was a tricky lesson, so well done for getting to the end of it. Please check and correct your answers. So the next lesson we're going to learn about is about bars, tombolos. Yes, that is a real word. Beaches and sand dunes. Now these are all features or landforms of deposition. So whereas before we learned about erosion, we learned about caves, arches, stacks, stumps and headlands, we're now learning about features of deposition at the coast. Thank you.